Hey everyone, welcome to the Bearded Brother podcast. I'm the Bearded Brother. This is my podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a lot of people's favorite person, John Calvin. But before we get into that, I want to tell a story about my roommate. My roommate he was a guy, let's just say he had a lot of issues and he was a non-Christian. And so I was trying to witness to him. And so on my campus, I went to a Bible study. And at this Bible study, I asked for prayer for help witnessing to my roommate. And there was this one guy who was like, I got it. Don't worry. And so we go to pray and, bow our heads. And he goes, Dear God, please help Curtis realize his roommate is not elect. And I just went like literally from the middle of prayer. I just went like, what? And I looked around to see if anybody had reacted to that at all. And to my surprise, everybody was just like, yeah, please help him to realize. And that was kind of like a shocking introduction, even though already knew about Calvinism, but kind of like an introduction to Calvinism for me. And I'll just say up front, that's not a fair representation of Calvinism, but it's the representation of Calvinism that I got. And so there's this thing that happens a lot of times when people become Calvinists, and what it's referred to is the cage stage. And basically, it's people when they become a Calvinist, they get so like ferocious about the doctrines of Calvinism that it's better that they would be put in a cage and left alone. And I believe that comes from like Calvinists themselves. That's a term created by Calvinists for Calvinists. So I'm not the original shot taker on that one. But I think what what happens with that is there's a lot of people who really struggle with doubt in their faith, or rather doubt of if they are saved or not, if they're truly saved or not. And so when they encounter the doctrines of grace, specifically when they discover the doctrines of Calvinism, it's kind of this very refreshing and uplifting thing for them because, of course, one of the doctrines of Calvinism is that once you are saved, you are always saved, and that's assurance of your salvation. And so that's something that feels very good for the Calvinists, and so they want to cling onto that, and so they cling onto it with very, very much intensity, and they let everybody know about it. And so this guy, I'm sure, is one of those people. And if you think hard enough, I bet you know one of these people. If you've ever been to a Bible study and all of a sudden the Bible study became a conversation about Calvinism, that was probably a cage stage Calvinist. And cage stage Calvinists, we love you. Some of you watching this video probably are like, that was me. I was a cage stage Calvinist. And so it's kind of funny though, because of that experience, I became a cage stage Arminian because I was so offended by this experience that I had where I felt like Calvinism was revealed to me to be what it is, or as it truly is. And so I'll just say that I have actually now a lot of respect for um, Calvinists and the tradition, and even John Calvin. But the funny thing about John Calvin, and if you don't know, John Calvin is the guy who Calvinism is named after. And uh, I in college I had to read some of his work, and it was actually really good. And a lot of what he wrote about was actually not the doctrines of Calvinism. And it would be even wrong to say that he created Calvinism. Calvinism is based on a lot of his ideas, but he did not come up with the official list of the core doctrines of Calvinism. But John Calvin probably would have said to this guy at the Bible study, our cage stage friend, he would have said something like, hold on, only God knows who's elect, and God works through you when you proclaim the gospel to people, when you love them, when you witness to them, and all that. And so John Calvin would have probably been the first person to speak up at that Bible study, even though nobody else did, and I assume they were all Calvinists. None of the Calvinists there spoke up, but John Calvin would have had something to say to that guy. And so today we're talking about John Calvin, and specifically we're talking about why John Calvin would hate Calvinists. And there's a long list of reasons for that we're going to get into. So, what is Calvinism? First and foremost, John Calvin never called himself a Calvinist. And he even talked about never getting into sectarianism, which is kind of like, well, I'm in this guy's camp or I'm in that guy's camp. And so he wrote against that. And it's kind of funny when he heard that people were calling themselves Calvinists, even in his time, he was like horrified because he was like, we don't do that. We are followers of Jesus. And so in his own time, when people were calling themselves Calvinists, when they started that, he was like, "No, don't call yourself a Calvinist. I don't want to. I don't want that on me." And so it's really funny. In some ways, the most Calvinist thing you could do is stop calling yourself a Calvinist. The ideas that we kind of get from Calvinism were actually founded or written at the Synod of Dort 55 years after John Calvin died in 1618. And so these were written after Calvin died, although a lot of it was inspired from his ideas. So it's not like they totally made it up and attributed it to him. But the thing is that a lot of Calvinists today look nothing like John Calvin, and John Calvin might have even having them arrested or even executed in some cases. And so we're going to look at some of those misalignments today. So at the Synod of Dort, they formulated the 5 points of Calvinism, and you might hear people sometimes say that they're like a 4-point Calvinist or a 5-point Calvinist. So the 5 points of Calvinism, or the acronym I should say, is TULIP, like the flower. Very kind of funny that Reformed culture is so masculine and their logo or their symbol is the tulip. So the T stands for total depravity, and the idea of total depravity is that you on your own are incapable of accepting Christ. And even some Calvinists will go further with this and say, like, you are so morally depraved is a word that you'll hear a lot, that you are even incapable without the Holy Spirit regenerating you. You are incapable of even doing a good act, and that any good act you would commit would ultimately be an act of self gratification or something like that. The U in TULIP stands for unconditional election, which means that once God has chosen you to be saved, that's it, and there's nothing you can do about it. The L in TULIP is probably the most controversial one, and usually when people say they're like a 4-point Calvinist, they'll mean they don't really agree with the L, which the L stands for limited atonement, which means that Jesus did not actually die for everyone. He only died for those he chose to be saved. The I stands for irresistible grace, which means that once God imparts his grace on you to receive the gospel, that you don't really have a say in the matter because God's grace is so overwhelmingly powerful that you just will accept. And so maybe I shouldn't say you don't have a say in the matter. It's more like God's grace will be so powerful in your life that there's no way you would ever say no. And then lastly is the P, which a lot of times, if people aren't Calvinists, they might even still hang on to this point, which is perseverance of the saints, which means that once you are saved, you are always saved. Or rather, once you become a true believer in the faith, you will never leave the faith. So, with that out of the way, was this guy's prayer really Calvinist? Ironically, Calvinists are some of the biggest church planters and missionaries in the world. And so John Calvin was focused on almost building God's kingdom here on earth, but many Calvinists today are actually focused on evangelization and missionary work. William Carey was a famous missionary to India, and he had to fight pushback from hyper Calvinists who didn't think he should go evangelize. They thought that we should just pray for pagan nations instead of evangelize them because God's already chosen who will be saved and who will not be saved. This is kind of the classic rebuttal or question to Calvinism, which is, well, if God's already chosen, then why evangelize? And John Calvin never really reconciled this issue. He just kind of held them both at the same time, which is, yes, God is sovereign and has chosen his elect, and yes, we should evangelize. And that's not a terrible position to hold if you're a Calvinist, that God is sovereign and he's chosen his elect and he's called you to evangelize, and he works through that. So our cage stage friends, Calvinism is really more like hyper Calvinism, and John Calvin probably would have corrected him, and most Calvinist pastors today would have called him out as well. But kind of the funny thing when it comes to Calvin is that Calvin was probably not a true Calvinist. When it comes to limited atonement, it really seems like John Calvin more believed in unlimited atonement, which is that Jesus died for everyone. And we can see this in some of the commentaries that he wrote. John Calvin wrote a famous prayer where he said that Jesus was the savior of the whole human race. In another place, he says that Jesus suffered for all mankind. And it goes on and on. It really seems like John Calvin believed that Jesus died for the whole of humanity, even if God did not elect all to be saved. So the Synod of Dort went even further than John Calvin would have. And if John Calvin was around today, many Calvinists would say that he's a little weak on the doctrines of grace. There's one issue that kind of divides Calvinism, and it's over this issue of predestination. And so there's one camp called single predestination, and there's another camp called double predestination. And double predestination is the idea that not only does God elect some people to go to heaven, but he also elects some people to go to hell. And John Calvin was a big double predestinationist. And so now most Calvinists you'll meet are not double predestinationists, but John Calvin was. Calvin even called this a dreadful decree, but he didn't see how logically you could get away from it. That if God chooses some people for heaven, it means he chooses some people from hell. And this is something that most modern Calvinists soften. And so to the Calvinist who believes in single predestination, John Calvin would probably say that that's just a cop-out and that the logic doesn't hold up. And so if that's you, Calvin would have beef with you. To switch gears a little bit, Calvin held some views on communion that most Calvinists today would find themselves in disagreement with. And here's what I mean. So most Protestants today or Reformed peoples today would view communion as a symbolic or memorial, the memorial view, which is the view Zwingli popularized, which is that we take communion in remembrance of Christ. And John Calvin had a big problem with this view. And so if you don't know, there's kind of three views of communion. The first one is the traditional Catholic view, which is called transubstantiation. And this is that Jesus' body and blood is literally, physically present when you take communion. The other one is memorialism, which I just mentioned, which is kind of the normal evangelical Protestant view that we take communion in remembrance, in memorial of Jesus. And Calvin disagreed with both of these views, and he thought that both were serious errors on communion. Calvin's view was that Christ was spiritually present in the communion, not physically or not merely symbolically. So Zwingli, the main guy promoting memorialism, got chewed out a bunch by Calvin, who viewed memorialism as a huge and really dangerous error. But most Calvinists today, at least kind of the Reformed Baptist or Reformed non-denominational branch of Protestantism, hold to this view of memorialism that Calvin would chew you out for. Worth noting that a lot of Presbyterians are still faithful to John Calvin's view on this of the kind of middle ground he proposed. But here's where it gets really interesting. What would Calvin think of Reformed Baptists? And the honest answer is he wouldn't call you Reformed at all. In the time of Calvin, there was this group called the Anabaptists, and they were the group that came before the Baptists. And so Calvin was a huge infant Baptist. He never wavered from that. He always believed that babies should be baptized at birth or shortly after. And he believed this because he believed that baptism was the sign of the new covenant. And this was a key part of his theology. So in Switzerland at the time, there was a big pushback against these Anabaptists. And Zwingli, who was located in Zurich at the time, actually drowned an Anabaptist leader for his heresy of believing in believer's baptism instead of infant baptism. Very similarly, Geneva's laws under Calvin made it a punishable offense to reject infant baptism. So the Reformed Baptist category is almost a contradiction in itself, and John Calvin would have viewed them as very dangerous. This includes the Acts 29 crowd, this includes the Young Restless Reformed movement, and John Calvin would have rejected them entirely. And it's not about sprinkling or dunking, and it's not about whether you're 5 or 13. It's about It's about John Calvin's view of covenant theology as it relates to baptism. So again, on baptism, John Calvin kind of found himself in the middle ground, and he didn't go to the Catholic view, which is that baptism actually removes the stain of original sin from your soul, or that it saves you in some way. And he didn't go to the other side, which is that baptism is just a symbol, but instead he believed that baptism was the means of grace that sealed you into the covenant community. And so to this end, he actually believed that once you were baptized as a baby, that meant you were regenerate, meaning that the Holy Spirit had worked in you in a way that you are saved. And so not only was it the entrance into the covenant community, but it was actually the first step in salvation. And of course, Reformed Baptists are totally against this. They have a completely different view of salvation and of covenant. And for Reformed Baptists, it's about the personal decision that you make to follow Christ and not the decision your parents make to induct you into the church and receive salvation that way. But that's what John Calvin believed. And this isn't a tiny quirk. It's actually really, really different covenant theology between Calvin and many Calvinists today. And I know what you're thinking, surely Calvin wouldn't be that against me, right? Well, depending on what you believe, he may have been. And there's a story about this guy named Severitus, and basically he came to town and he was a non-Trinitarian. So this is like truly a heretic. And non-Trinitarian is someone who believes that there is no Trinity and that God is, in this case, he believed that there is one person and one God. So we would say there are three persons in one God, and he would say there's one person and one God. And so he believed this, and I will give this caveat. He was warned not to come to Geneva or there'd be trouble, and he came anyway. And so the city of Geneva put him on trial for his heresy, and they executed him. And so John Calvin, being John Calvin, of course, he wanted a nice means of execution. He wanted a beheading, a simple old school beheading. But the city of Geneva wanted to burn this guy, Severitus, at the stake. And so Severitus actually appealed to John Calvin and said, please don't let them execute me. And John Calvin was like, well, no, he should be executed because he's a heretic. But the city council wanted him to be burned at the stake. And so they did not listen to John Calvin and behead him. Instead, they burnt him at the stake. And they got what's called green wood, which is like fresh cut wood, which still has moisture from the tree in it. And what that did is it burned slower. And so they slowly burnt this guy to death. And so it's important to remember that John Calvin was a man of his time. And this was a very common practice back then. And a Catholic principality may have very well likely done the same thing to a heretic entering their community. But here's the point. Calvin believed that government had a duty to punish heretics. And most of our Baptist friends, most of our Calvinist friends today, I notice, are not burning people at the stake and are not beheading anyone. Maybe the cage stagers, though. And I have to say, John Calvin probably would have exiled me, and he would have been tempted to execute some of you. And it's not hype. He was really serious about defending his city from what he viewed as heresy. The Baptist Church, there's actually an acronym that was very popular in the 1800s about all the key principles of Baptists. And the S in Baptist actually stands for separation of church and state. And so this is totally against Calvin's worldview, and he would view it as theologically inconsistent. Calvin also would have had an issue with the way most Calvinists do church today. In the city of Geneva, it was the law that everybody had to be in church on Sunday. And so he believed in compulsory church attendance. Calvin believed in a very simplistic worship where there was no instruments, only psalms, and it was a very bare bones liturgy with no bells and whistles, which of course many Calvinists today, or many big Calvinists today, are part of mega churches with flashing lights and lasers and all sorts of things. Whereas Calvin actually dictated which songs could be sung, and how they could be sung. Calvin also held church courts where people were held accountable for moral failures, and even excommunications were imposed. One cool thing, though, he actually requested to be buried in an unmarked grave because he didn't want anybody to venerate his burial site. So modern Calvinism is this broad tent, and it contains people that Calvin would have considered allies, or maybe brothers that have gone astray, or maybe some full-blown heretics in there. But this isn't really Calvin's fault. He never really wanted this following or this ideology built after him. Calvinism is such a broad label that it's kind of lost its meaning. And it raises the question, what happens to a theology, or what holds it together when it gets so far from its founder? And I don't think it's Calvin. I think it's probably the God he was pointing to. Specifically, the sovereignty that outlasted some of the finer details that Calvin was very hung up on. Ironically, that's the most Calvinist thing about Calvinism. So, where do you land on Calvinism? Are you a 5, 4 point, 0 point? Let me know, drop it in the comments. And if you're Reformed and I got something wrong, tell me. Please, I can handle it. And if you like this conversation, if this is your kind of conversation, stick around. Wait, before you go, you almost forgot to like and subscribe and leave a comment with a topic you want to see covered in a future video. And hopefully you didn't forget about the new episodes we have every Tuesday and Thursday, and the live stream book club at 6 o'clock on Sundays, where we go through my annotated version of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Link in the description. We'll see you next time.